The Subcommittee on Europe of the House Foreign Affairs Committee will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to examine the President's State Department and Foreign Operations budget request for Europe and Eurasia for fiscal year 2025. I'd also like to welcome the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, who is joining us today. He will participate following all other members in today's hearing. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. We are here to consider the President's fiscal year 2025 budget request for the State Department and USAID's operations in Europe. Ultimately, Congress has the power of the purse, as the House will determine this week by voting on the State and Foreign Operations Appropriations Act on the House floor. However, we appreciate the opportunity to consider the administration's budget request for Europe because it indicates what resources the administration believes it needs to address pressing national security challenges on our continent, on the continent. Money is policy, and where the administration intends to allocate its funding is indicative of its policies and its priorities. I'll start by highlighting the importance of congressional engagement in our nation's foreign policy. While the Congress appropriates money, we also have the duty to the American people to ensure that their hard-earned taxpayer dollars are being spent responsibly and with the necessary amount of oversight to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. During today's hearing, I hope that our witnesses are prepared to address whatever concerns that members raise in the interests of transparency. A constructive policy in Europe and in Eurasia is crucial to U.S. national security. As a bloc, the European Union is the U.S.'s single largest trading partner, with an estimated $1.3 trillion in trade in goods and services in 2022. As of 2022, U.S. foreign direct investment in the EU was $2.7 trillion, with European foreign direct investment in the U.S. totaling $2.4 trillion. Moreover, Europe is home to our closest and longest-standing allies and security partners. The vast majority of the NATO alliance is located in Europe, and I am glad that for the first time in many years, a majority of the alliance will hit the minimum 2% of GDP defense spending threshold. This is due to transformative investments in defense on the part of our European allies. That said, there are still numerous allies who will not yet hit this important defense spending target this year, and I strongly urge them to meet this target immediately or have a credible plan to do so as soon as possible. I look forward to welcoming our fellow NATO members to Washington during next month's summit to hear a direct update on the status of alliance spending. The United States cannot go it alone in the face of the unholy alliance of dictators assembling around the world. Simply put, we need allies. Throughout Russia's unprovoked and illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, our European allies have made sure that the U.S. is not standing alone with Ukraine against the greatest threat to Europe in decades. While the Biden administration dithered, European nations moved first on providing Ukraine with Stinger and Javelin missiles systems in February 2022 to stymie the initial Russian assault. European nations also led on providing modern main battle tanks, long-range missiles, and advanced fighter jets to Ukraine. Europe has even outspent the U.S. on non-security assistance commitments to Ukraine by a difference of $50 billion. I applaud this leadership from our European allies. That is what burden sharing does indeed look like. Additionally, I encourage our partners in Europe to continue waking up to the dangers posed by the Chinese Communist Party as well. The democracies of the world have a sacred duty to defend the values that we preach and which the CCP openly opposes. Given the avenues for the CCP to exert influence over our free societies throughout coercive economic practices is unacceptable. We must be clear-eyed about the threat that China poses to peace and prosperity in Europe and around the world. I look forward to our conversation today to discuss the administration's policy in Europe. With Putin's war continuing to rage in Ukraine, democratic backsliding in Georgia, high tensions in the Western Balkans, and many other pressing challenges to peace and stability on the continent, this is truly a critical period for the future of Europe and for the United States. The Chair now recognizes the ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, for any statement they may have.
Well, thank you, Chairman Keane, for holding this important hearing today, and to our witnesses for their testimony in the fiscal year 25 European budget request. The European continent has long been a region critical to U.S. national security interests. Our transatlantic bonds with some of our oldest allies, like the United Kingdom and France, as well as Germany, the Baltics, and Poland, are based in our shared beliefs in democracy, rule of law, and freedom of speech. Beyond our shared values, robust and active U.S. foreign policy in the past year has brought a landmark nuclear energy partnership to Poland, a surge in humanitarian and economic support for displaced Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh, and increased multilateral cooperation through the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. At the same time, the reconstitution of the Northern Ireland Assembly, a cession of Finland and Sweden into NATO, and democracy support for partners in the Belarusian opposition and in Central Europe are representative of the importance of U.S. engagement across the continent. Yet remaining challenges in Europe continue to demand U.S. engagement. Nowhere is this more important than in Ukraine. In April, the chairman and I met with President Zelensky in Kyiv for over an hour to discuss the state of the conflict, the desire to transfer Russian sovereign assets, and the battlefield needs of air defense and long-range missiles. The U.S. continues to approach these challenges with creativity and tenacity, devising mechanisms like a $50 billion loan to Ukraine by using the interest of Russian sovereign assets as collateral, and adapting policies to reflect the evolving needs of the Ukrainian military, such as allowing strikes into Russian territory with U.S. origin weapons. These actions save Ukrainian lives, and I urge the administration to continue to adapt and innovate policies that ensure Ukraine's victory over Russia. I also commend allies and partners, including Romania, Denmark, and others who have provided air defense systems to Ukraine. The chairman and I led a letter in April following our trip to Kyiv, calling for allies and partners to provide additional air defense and long-range missile stocks to Europe. It's reassuring to see our allies step up to the plate in Ukraine's time of need. While Ukraine fights to preserve its democracy, leaders across Europe have sought to undermine democratic principles, the rule of law, and the values that underpin our transatlantic alliance. Most recently, in Georgia, the Georgian Dream Party forced through a Kremlin-inspired foreign agent law and signed a strategic partnership agreement with China, a country actively supporting Russia's war in Ukraine, even as the Kremlin continues to occupy 20% of Georgia's territory. Meanwhile, in Hungary, Prime Minister Orban has clamped down on dissent and escalated persecution of the LGBTQ+ people and other minorities, all the while embracing Russian malign influence and Chinese investment in Budapest. The actions of Orban, as well as the Georgian Dream, are an extreme concern, and they undermine the long-term interests of the Georgian and Hungarian people. Meanwhile, elections across Europe this year have given rise to far-right parties who promote an isolationist, anti-immigrant worldview which has no place in our vibrant and diverse societies. As we await upcoming elections in France and the United Kingdom, and our own elections later this year, we must stand ready to reject those extremist ideas that contradict our sacred democratic values of inclusion and acceptance. Finally, as we approach the NATO Summit in Washington, marking the 75th anniversary of this alliance, we must redouble our commitment to Article 5 and again make clear that any attack on any NATO member will result in a full and undeniable response. The unity of our alliance is our strength, and we must use this opportunity to deepen our cooperation with Ukraine, ensure adequate defense spending on our allies, and strengthen partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. Unfortunately, just as the threats we face are most acute and the desire for U.S. engagement, particularly in Europe, is the most warranted, House Republicans have proposed a 12% cut to the state and foreign operations budgets. These cuts will undoubtedly undermine the State Department and USAID's ability to carry out their mission. As Russia continues to commit to war crimes in Ukraine, deepens partnerships with North Korea, China, and Iran, and acts brazenly on the world stage, we should be expanding our diplomatic engagements around the world. Anything less will send a message to the autocratic world, and particularly to China, that our actions will go undeterred. I look forward to questioning our witnesses on this important issue of adequately funding the State Department and USAID for fiscal year 25 to ensure they can carry out their missions and continue to do the hard but enduring work of expanding our national security. Thank you, Chairman Keane. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that opening statements might be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a panel of distinguished witnesses before us today on this important topic. Ambassador James O'Brien is Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the Department of State. Ambassador Aaron McKee is the Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Europe and Eurasia at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Thank you for being here, both of you. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I ask you to keep your verbal remarks to 5 minutes. I now recognize Ambassador O'Brien for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member. I'm really heartened that I can agree with nearly every sentence in both opening statements. Yeah, I'm reminded that we sit in the building named after Sam Rayburn, who led the charge to prepare America to enter World War II. And I think we're at a stage where we have to prepare ourselves for the long term and turn away from the call of isolationism that I think would endanger our allies and ourselves. So what we're discussing is a budget request from the administration. I understand there are other proposals around. What we are suggesting is it's $1.26 billion. Of that, about $722 million is for the assistance accounts, and there's about $583 million that is for the operating capacity of the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, which I lead. These are about 3 to 6% increases. They're also meant to normalize our spending because we have been greatly dependent on supplemental expenditures to deal with the extraordinary threats posed by Russia's further invasion of Ukraine. As just one example, if we're not able to maintain these levels, we could end up losing 70% of the staff that manages the sanctions programs against Russia and Iran. I realize that's nothing that this committee wants, but that's the consequence of some of the cuts that are proposed. Now, how do we propose to spend that money? In rough proportion, 38% of the funding will be spent on Ukraine. About 26% will be spent on Euro-Atlantic integration. That is that bucket of, say, 11 countries that run along the southern part of Europe from the Adriatic to the Caspian Sea. And about 26% on what I'll call global governance challenges. The ability of us to compete and defeat China economically, the ability of us to work with our European partners. As Chairman Keene's opening remarks noted, these are our largest trading partners, and when we cooperate, we are able to succeed because we're the most powerful, prosperous economic bloc in the world. Now, how exactly will we propose to spend the money? And we can go into this more in questions, but I'll look at each one of those 3 buckets in order. First on Ukraine. So the goal of our strategy is pretty simple. We want Ukraine to win. We want it to thrive while it's fighting on its way to victory. How does it do that? It does it by holding Russia in the east, destabilizing Russia's firing positions and the places from which it threatens Ukrainian territory in Crimea and right up against Ukrainian lines, and restoring its economic life. That means having adequate air defense and the ability to export through the southern ports. When that happens, we know that Ukraine's economy recovers, its tax base improves, and it's able to begin paying much more of its own way. We saw that over the last winter when Ukraine's grain exports began to reach pre-war levels, and economic life in its core industries, especially its iron and steel industries, began to recover from essentially single-digit utilization rates. So that's where we're putting our money to work, and Ambassador McKee and I can describe specific programs we're using there. The second bucket, again, about a quarter of the spending we're proposing, is for Euro-Atlantic integration. Over the last 2 years, we've had a historic movement of consolidation that the EU has offered 9 of the countries along that graph some future as part of the EU. And NATO is having discussions about either admitting or bringing closer many of the countries. We're now also seeing a bit of a reaction. Elites in some of those countries, the ranking member mentioned Georgia, and well, Hungary is a current member, but also within Bosnia and some other countries, some elites are bucking against having to make the hard reforms that are needed to join the EU and NATO. We have to work together to see that that doesn't continue. We're also seeing Russia trying to be very active in that area, and we are having some success in countering Russia's malign influence. For example, with Canada, the UK, and support from the EU, we uncovered a Russian disinformation plot to destabilize the democratically elected, European-oriented government in Moldova. The third bucket, again about a quarter of what we're discussing, is on global governance issues, and this is especially important with regard to China. And I'm happy to describe more what we are doing with our European allies in that regard. Thank you for your time and for having us here today.
We thank you. We thank you, Assistant Secretary O'Brien. I'd now like to recognize Ambassador McKee for 5 minutes of your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member, distinguished members of the Subcommittee on Europe, and I really appreciate the invitation to speak to you today on USAID's assistance and, of course, the budget for fiscal year 2025. I welcome the opportunity to discuss the agency's priorities to advance and support, obviously, our foreign policy and national security goals in Europe and Eurasia. And to that end, the President's request for fiscal year 2025 includes $722.3 million for Europe and Eurasia through the IECA account. And this will directly support U.S. leadership in international development with the aims of achieving a durable peace and a dignified peace in the region. Starting with Ukraine, we are very grateful for the overwhelming bipartisan support shown for desperately needed funding this past April. Our highest priority has been and remains ensuring Ukraine's victory, as Ambassador O'Brien already indicated. That is fundamental to the peace and an enduring peace throughout Europe and Eurasia. In the face of Russia's recent attacks on civilian energy infrastructure, USAID, together with our other interagency colleagues, are rapidly deploying assistance to bring back significant electric power, heat generation by this winter through repairs and delivering materials that will protect families that have been repeatedly targeted, families and facilities. We will continue to lay the groundwork for private investment in new power generation, support reforms in the energy sector, and increase regional energy security through investments in diversified generation and decentralized distribution. We can't talk about the region without starting with Ukraine. The FY25 request is driven by recognition that economic and security assistance to Ukraine go hand in hand. Putin knows how critical Ukraine's economy is in this fight. And that's why he's actively targeting Ukraine's grain exports, energy infrastructure, civilians, to derail this strategy, to erode confidence and undermine morale. It is our hope now that U.S. resources will help Ukraine eventually build the economy it must have to generate greater revenue, sustain livelihoods, and decrease reliance on support from us and other donors. One way that we're doing this is support to small and medium enterprises. In May of 2024, just last month, USAID had supported over 26,000 small and medium enterprises in the agriculture, IT, and manufacturing sectors. What does this mean? We helped create or sustain over 156,000 jobs. Those are taxpayers. Those are folks that are in it for the long haul to help Ukraine not just win the fight, but win the future. In Moldova, right next door, we have enabled the energy sector to break away from Russia's 30-year coercive grip by diversifying energy sources and increasing their integration with the European energy market. Compared to a near total dependence on Gazprom in 2021, the government of Moldova met 100% of its gas needs with non-Russian supplies in 2023. That is a big success. In the Caucasus, as both the chairman and ranking member mentioned, we are responding to new challenges, but we also see new opportunities. In Georgia, we are focused on ensuring that Georgia remains on its democratic path and runs a free and fair election in October, and hopefully regains momentum towards EU accession. The ruling party's passage of the foreign influence law and anti-Western rhetoric gravely threatens civil society, independent media, and demonstrate the importance of USAID's assistance to bolster the democratic forces there. In Armenia, we are seizing an important opportunity to help this reforming democracy strengthen its economy and build its overall resilience against external pressure. Additionally, we are increasing our work on the Middle Corridor as a major gateway connecting Central Asia to Europe, which diversifies movement of goods, services, and reduces dependence on routes through Russia, the PRC, and Iran. We continue to watch the Western Balkans closely to ensure stability is maintained and build on gains made in democracy, anti-corruption, and economic growth. So thanks to the ongoing and essential support from Congress, USAID has demonstrated tangible results and clear progress. We have and will deploy congressionally allocated funds to demonstrate U.S. leadership, counter Putin's influence, and fortify democratic institutions. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss our work today.
I thank you very much, Ambassador McKee. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questioning. And I want to start by thanking both of our witnesses for their time today and certainly for their service to our country. The integrity of the Dayton Accords and the sovereignty of Bosnia and Herzegovina itself are constantly under attack by Milorad Dodik, the president of Republika Srpska. The State Department has rightly sanctioned Dodik and many of his accomplices and enablers, and I have repeatedly called for these sanctions, which would be codified under the Upholding the Dayton Peace Agreement through Sanctions Act, my legislation that recently passed the House with the overwhelming bipartisan support. Yet, Dodik's dangerous provocations continue. Ambassador O'Brien, what further actions are being considered to tighten the screws on Dodik and his corrupt cronies?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your support on this issue. I think you've been a very strong voice in favor of what is one of the longest lasting peace arrangements in the world. And I was pleased to play some part in it in 1995 and to try to make sure that it is fit so that Bosnia and Herzegovina can move toward a future as part of the European Union. So that provides a few additional tools. The first item is that there is no support for what President Dodik discusses, whether it's dissociation, dissolution of Bosnia, independence of the Republika Srpska. Prime Minister Plenković in Croatia has said publicly that he opposes it, and we've seen no sign of support from Serbia either. Serbia knows that its path toward any kind of European future depends on respecting the international borders of the region, and that includes Bosnia. So when Mr. Dodik talks this way, it's an attempt to rile up his base, and one that we should not take as a sign of anything that's possible. Now, how do we then begin to enforce this and encourage him to work only within the legal procedures of the Dayton Agreement? Here, there are a couple of things. One is sanctions are important. I won't preview any specific sanctions. We just announced some additional sanctions.
And I'm grateful for those sanctions against Dodik.
And those are intended to make the case that public entities like Republika Srpska should operate on public budgets. not on the capture of state-owned enterprises or on non-transparent loans from unknown foreign sources. So that's what the sanctions are intended to get at. We'll add to that close cooperation with our European colleagues. They have both through the accession...
And to that point, can you,
Yeah.
Ambassador, if I could interrupt.
Please.
The EU has not imposed its own sanctions on Dodik, and how important is it for the Europeans to follow suit, and how are we using our U.S. pressure on our partners to join the U.S. in holding Dodik accountable through sanctions or other means?
Yeah, I think it's the other means in this case. I think we have the tool of sanctions readily available.
Right.
The EU, because it needs to get consensus among all the members, finds it sometimes difficult.
Do you have some perspective on the other means?
Yeah. So what it can do is withhold funding, as it did to Republika Srpska over the past year, deny benefits, in particular the benefits of joining a regional common market, unless the Republika Srpska is fully compliant with the Dayton Agreement. And we're working very closely with our EU colleagues on the roadmap necessary for that to happen. And if I may just, I'm sorry for going on so long, I just want to call out the spectacular work of our ambassador in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Michael Murphy.
He was with us last night for the incredible film Kiss the Future, and the president of Bosnia is here also.
I'm seeing him in 2 hours.
Wonderful, and we've had a tremendous back and forth, and I agree with you. He's been a wonderful envoy and representative.
And I just think it's a mark of how well he's done that President Dodik singles him out for special insult and recognition at every
Me
opportunity.
too. In its 2024 annual threat assessment, the U.S. intelligence community warned of a heightened risk of localized interethnic violence in the Western Balkans, including in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And you both, I'm going to run out of time, so I'd ask you both to respond in writing, if you could, how our state and our USAID working to lower the risk of ethnic conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I wish I had time to have you answer orally, but if you could get back to us in writing, I would be greatly appreciated. And now it is my honor to represent the ranking member for questions for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. There it goes. Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank our witnesses again. Yesterday, Transparency International Hungary, as well as one of the country's best-known investigative outlets, received notifications they're being investigated by Hungary's new Sovereign Protection Office, which seeks to target independent voices and organizations in Hungary. If I may, I'd ask unanimous consent for the record to submit this article from The Guardian dealing with Orban's government increasing efforts to crack down on independent voices.
So ordered.
I'd like to ask our witnesses, how does Orban's crackdown on opposition influences and his use of Russian-style laws undermine democracy in Hungary?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. So it's unfortunate, extraordinarily unfortunate, the Democratic backsliding, and we deeply appreciate Congress's recognition of this back in 21, where we re-engaged in Central and Eastern Europe with a focus on Hungary and Poland, although I will say Poland has shifted both its posture and its approach somewhat. So in Hungary, with the resources and our re-engagement, we are strengthening civic engagement in public life to be able to withstand and build greater resilience to these draconian laws that try and shut down vital voices. In 2023, we trained 22 municipal offices in Hungary on citizen engagement practices that involve citizens in dialogue and decision-making. And so in response to the sovereignty law recently passed, we have offered through this network and through these folks that have greater capacity now to respond to threats from the national or central level government, to help them understand the new legislation, how it may impact them, and then utilizing access to legal resources should they become threatened or even worse. And so we recognize it, and luckily we were able to get a bit out ahead of the curve and have a network of support in place.
Hungary's isolating itself. And I think here working with our European colleagues has been important. They are withholding close to $50 billion or euro in European money for Hungary over Hungary's violation of rule of law requirements. We are reinforcing that as best we can, and we see the effect in NATO and other diplomatic arenas where Hungary increasingly is isolated. And I think Orban's relatively poor performance in the elections earlier this month is an indicator that his inability to bring home either the money or to show the kind of leadership that he wants is is doing real damage to his ability to affect democracy everywhere. But that's something we have to watch, particularly as Hungary takes over the rotating chair of the European Union. We have to make sure that he's seen as a leader who uses illegitimate tactics, not as a full partner.
I agree. I think that it's not surprising to see that after a poor performance that this is great a crackdown on the media itself, which is really a crackdown on the people of Hungary themselves. I don't know if we have time, but if we go a little further on Georgia's dream and their support for Kremlin-inspired foreign agent laws, and they're touting the relationships with China, and how this affects their position on the Euro-Atlantic community. We've touched upon it, but in the minute that remains, I'd like to give you the chance to have greater detail on what we can do to help shape this sad, turnaround and backsliding that's occurring.
In broad terms, in Georgia's constitution, put there by a Georgian Dream-led government, it says they want to join the EU and NATO. The EU this week, and we repeatedly, have delivered publicly and privately the message that this violence against the opposition, the foreign agent law, the awarding of a port contract to a Chinese company, all of these things jeopardize the path toward the EU and NATO, which more than 80% of Georgia's citizens support.
Yeah, I was at a dinner last night with the many ambassadors from Europe as well as the EU ambassador, and we talked about the Russian disinformation and the effect it's having on democratic process and elections. We have free elections. They don't. Russia doesn't. So they feel they were at liberty to use this tactic. It's something they're concerned about in Europe. It's something we should be concerned about here in the United States. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Joe Wilson, for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Ambassador O'Brien, I realize, and the world continues to watch in horror, as war criminal Putin leveled cities. He began with Aleppo, Syria. That shouldn't be forgotten, the mass murder conducted there. And then it was continued at Mariupol in Ukraine. Again, unnecessary total destruction of a city. And now to go after Kharkiv, a city in Ukraine of 1.4 million people, targeting civilians in the war of murderous aggression. The entire world is in a global battle of dictators with rule of gun invading democracies with rule of law. War criminal Putin invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022, and the Hamas puppets of the regime of Tehran invaded Israel on October 7, 2023. Last year, I visited Bucha, Ukraine, where Putin troops murdered innocent families, tying their hands behind their back. Last week, I visited Kibbutz Ner Oz, where, again, Iranian puppets murdered innocent families, fulfilling the Hamas Covenant Article 7, which provides for killing of all Jews. Sadly, today, it seems the administration is not committed to Ukrainian victory of territorial integrity, as we would support for every American state and territory. War criminal Putin and his forces have determined the exact range to strike Ukraine from within Russia, and such that Ukraine cannot strike back. While some restrictions on Ukrainian counterattacks against these attacks have been lifted, it's clearly not enough. And I appreciate that, in fact, Ranking Member Greg Meeks has been promoting the ability to strike back. And Assistant Secretary, Ukraine must win this war, and they are motivated for their existence, but only if we let them. Putin's false escalation threats have been proven time and time again to be false. Will this administration commit to victory by allowing Ukraine to strike all legitimate military targets in Russia. And I want to make it clear that it's bipartisan support for the ability of Ukraine to defend itself.
Thank you, and thank you for your outspoken leadership on this issue. As I said in my opening statement, our goal is that Ukraine win and that it thrive while it's preparing to win. And I know we have a strategy that's due to be provided to the House, and we're working to get it here as quickly as we can. Ukraine has the right to strike Russia where it can with its weapons. The discussion we have is about how best to use the weapons we provide to them. Since those weapons arrived, and for too many months, and I know many on this committee were very strong supporters of the supplemental bill, for too many months, Ukraine could not fight back. And so Russia was able to launch tactical airstrikes using horrific weapons from very close in. Now Ukraine can strike back, and we're seeing it reclaim territory, push Russia back, and destabilize Russia's ability, and also prevent Russia from re-equipping itself in the way that it wanted. This is the right path for Ukraine to win, and we're happy maybe in another forum to talk about the tactics of that. But thank you, Mr.
But hey,
Congressman.
again, this is bipartisan. This should not be a partisan situation, and already the administration understands the international law provides that you can strike back, as was done against the Houthis as they're attacking by rocket at the Red Sea shipping lanes. And then, as I mentioned, Ms. Secretary, last week, I was grateful to be in Israel, where I discovered the famine that wasn't, as correctly editorialized on June 21st by the New York Post. Quote, Gaza's supposed famine never happened. It was never more than Hamas propaganda eagerly consumed by the left. The chief UN Food Insecurity Agency announced this month that it finds the analysis suggesting a famine wasn't plausible and lacks supporting evidence. It's really sad to me that this turns out from the Famine Early Warning System, a USAID project, and that this particular project, and I'm a strong supporter of USAID, I just can't imagine the incorrect analysis, and we don't have time to answer, except this needs to be looked into, to come up with a famine that didn't occur. And then we find out that it was actually a study paid for by American taxpayers. This is not right, and we know a famine didn't occur, and we know that if there is a problem with famine, it's called Hamas. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I now recognize Mr. Amo from Rhode Island for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Assistant Secretary O'Brien and Ms. McKee, for being here today and all of the work that you do. You conduct work that is essential to projecting American strength, influence, and partnership in Europe. However, instead of projecting strength, the current Republican state and foreign operations budget proposes massive cuts that would decimate your work. We're talking about using a meat cleaver to hack 13% off the Department of State's budget and 28% off of the USAID operational budget. This side of the dais knows that the State Department and USAID are essential to safeguarding our national security and believes in making sure that you have the resources to carry that work. Budgets reflect our values, and these proposed Republican cuts reflect a dangerous political agenda that wants to retreat from America's global leadership. One area of concern to me is the harmful and partisan cuts to LGBTQ programs during a time of rising violence and hate speech against that community. Countries like Hungary have passed laws that restrict the essential freedom to love. So, Assistant Secretary O'Brien, if enacted, how would poison pill provisions in the Republican budget, including a funding ban for the special envoy to advance the human rights of LGBTQI persons, harm your work in Europe to protect the rights of LGBTQ people?
Thank you, and thank you for your outspoken leadership on this issue. I'll offer a few general thoughts, and maybe Ambassador McKee will have something to add. I'm proud to advocate U.S. law and U.S. values, particularly when it comes to the protection and inclusion of LGBTQ people. The Special Envoy is a very good partner in working particularly with many of our European allies and their populations who want to see more protection. So we've seen over this last year same-sex marriage in Greece, legalized marriage equality this year in Liechtenstein, and continued work by governments across Europe, and they are good partners for us as well, and along with the Special Envoy. I'd note another issue. Often the groups who organize around these issues are extraordinarily effective examples of freedom of association, one of the prized American values. And I'd hate to be put in the position of having to say that I can support some freedom of association, but not others based on the content of what people are advocating. That would put our diplomats in a really terrible position. So I think the best way to support U.S. values and to support the populations who often need our protection is to continue these programs, and particularly the work of the Special Envoy. I'd note the administration has issued a statement that it would veto the bill that you describe. So I hope that we can move toward a discussion of where we agree on supporting U.S. law and U.S. values rather than the early approaches that won't be enacted.
Thank you. Ms. McKee.
And if I could just briefly
Yes,
add
please.
that with an eye towards this, and as we've seen in democratic backsliding in closing spaces, whether in Central and Eastern Europe and elsewhere, we have increased our support to civil society and other activist groups, as well as legal aid for those who are persecuted for their beliefs or their preference for who they love. And so with those tools in our toolkit to make sure that there's greater protection. That said, countries that claim to be a democracy but deny voice, access to services, or participation by parts of their citizenry are not democracies, and we know that. And so we're going to hold them to account consistently. And with this body, we appreciate your support.
Well, I stand in concurrence on that point, that those democratic values have to be lived. And you brought up the vested interest that the United States has in preventing democratic backsliding in Europe. And I'm going to highlight quickly some of the work that you're doing at USAID with the Democracy Delivers initiative. This initiative, helps fledgling democracies demonstrate that economic empowerment goes hand in hand with democratic reforms. And I know that it's currently working in Armenia and Moldova to support their continued democratic development. We know that when citizens experience the benefits that democracy delivers, they have an incentive to stand firm against democratic backsliding. So if you could, in writing, submit, would love to hear how this initiative is working and how it combats the People Republic of China's Belt and Road Initiative and where we need to continue to support the Democracy Delivers initiative going forward. So thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ramo. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. It is well known that China has provided enormous support to Russia's defense industrial base. The administration has taken limited steps to try to sever this malign relationship between Russia and China. However, numerous experts and even senior officials of this administration have publicly admitted that Russia's defense industrial base is improving and that China's support has been indispensable to this development. Assistant Secretary O'Brien, this administration's attempts to curtail China's support of Russia's illegal war in Ukraine are failing. Why is this administration not taking greater action to sever this malign relationship?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's true, Russia stays on the battlefield because of Chinese support. The greatest threat to European security now is being bankrolled by China. What we have done, in particular over the last 6 months, as other sanctions have limited Russians' options for markets, is highlight this role China is playing. I see a marked difference in the way our European allies discuss their relationships with China as a result. China is being put to a test of whether it believes it has a future of economic relationships in Europe or it wants to support Russia in this war that we will not allow to succeed. And that choice is one that will frankly take a little time to work through. We are attempting to focus their minds with a whole set of export controls and sanctions that, including a package recently released. We were joined by the European Union in its 14th package of Russia sanctions, including several Chinese companies as a part of that. So the coalition that has been successful in supporting Ukraine and taking away more than $400 billion from Russia, that's 4 years of its military budget, is very much focused on China's role. And that is putting China into quite a difficult position.
Assistant Secretary O'Brien, the State Department has announced today that you will be visiting Azerbaijan later this week and that you will meet with President Aliyev. What message will you deliver to President Aliyev, and will you make clear that there will be consequences for any future threats or aggression against Armenia?
Thank you for that. Yes, I will be there on tomorrow night. We are very clear with President Aliyev that this is a time to make peace. And it's a matter of not just Azerbaijan, which is hoping to be respected as a global leader when it hosts the Conference of Parties on climate change, but it's a matter for that entire region and for Central Asia. All of those countries now export to the world only through China or Russia. For them to have a path out, they need to work through Azerbaijan. One road goes through Georgia to the Black Sea, but another, potentially much larger road would go through Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkey. And in that regard, we need a peace agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia to put an end to the war and the horrible conflict that has existed since the 90s. And our message is it's time to make peace, and it's only in that context that we can resolve many of the issues of the war. We also talked to him about the importance of respecting human rights. That's a regular topic of conversation, including Secretary Blinken with him in just recent days, and I look forward to taking up that conversation with him as well.
And then a third question to you, sir, if I may. The administration's policy regarding Ukraine's ability to use U.S.-provided weapons against targets inside Russia can best be characterized, as with other decisions in this regard to Zelensky's ability to use weapons and get weapons from America, sometimes characterized as too little, too late. The initial policy change to allow Ukraine to hit targets in Russian territory did not occur until after Russian troops opened up a new front near Kharkiv, and even then, the administration's initial change was only a half step. The policy has been revised, but it's still unclear to Congress what exactly the policy is. Recent reporting indicates that the administration is restricting the use of U.S.-sourced weapons on Russia, on Russian territory to within 62 miles of the border of Ukraine, well short of the full 190-mile range of the ATACMS. How many air bases are within range of the ATACMS is the administration preventing Ukraine from hitting?
Thank you. So, as you know from our visit to Ukraine together, the greatest gap in Ukraine's ability to obtain weapons was when the supplemental was not made available for 5 or 6 months. And as General Cavoli said, the side that can't shoot tends to lose wars. So thank you for your leadership and your outspoken assistance in getting that supplemental passed. And as you heard from President Zelensky, that changed the situation. What we saw was President Putin attempt to rush an offensive into the field before the weapons that were provided for in the supplemental could reach Ukraine. What we have been trying to do is provide the weapons and focus them in areas that were of most immediate need. So first, that was where Russia was pursuing the initial offensive in that box right near Kharkiv. And now, as Jake Sullivan said last week, if Russia attempts to widen the front, Ukraine can reach out more. In terms of specific numbers, I think we should get a military briefer to talk to you. We are seeing dramatic shifts in Russia's ability to sustain its campaign against Ukraine because of the loss of facilities in the targeted area.
Thank you. I will work with you to arrange that. I now yield 5 minutes to Congresswoman Titus.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard a lot about democratic backsliding, and in Europe, you think of Hungary, you think of Belarus, but it's not limited there. We've seen anti-democratic parties elected in France, Germany, Italy. You've seen leaders that coming out of the Netherlands and Slovakia. I wonder how the U.S. is going to try to deal with these new partners and how it's going to kind of affect the whole EU relationship. And kind of related to that, we're going to be hosting a NATO summit here in 75th anniversary in just a couple of weeks in Washington. And how do we think that the rhetoric that we see coming from the other side or for coming from the former president is going to impact our relationship with some of these same actors through NATO?
Thank you. I think there are two main themes in the way we approach the elections in Europe, and they're somewhat similar to how we approach ours here. One of them is that it's very important for responsible parties to work together and to demonstrate that we can deliver on what people care about. So we see agreements to manage migration, and then we see the vote for extremist parties go down. We see agreements to provide adequate security. NATO is now stronger than ever. European states have increased spending by more than 18% in the last 2 years. We're now at 23 states meeting their commitments to pay for NATO. When this administration entered office, the number was 9. That's responsible parties doing what the citizens want to see. And that has a direct effect on when others come in. I'm encouraged that in the European Union now, it is a set of very strong pro-European parties who will have the primary positions going forward. And that will be confirmed over the next week. The second thing is we have to address the very real threat, particularly from Russia and some of its friends in and around Europe, to our democratic processes. So we have really stepped up our efforts to counter disinformation, cyber attacks, sabotage, other efforts that are attempting to skew our politics. And I think, though I only do foreign policy, I'd really like to make sure that we're mindful of that here as well. In terms of the NATO summit, I think what will emerge is that NATO is stronger and better prepared for the future than ever. Not only is spending up, but we'll announce that we have all of our regional defense plans now in executable form. That means we're spending the money in smart ways to keep our people safer. And I think that's the best answer to those who say that the only way forward is isolationism or to cut deals with dictators. We can stand up for ourselves, and that's what people want us to do.
Thank you. And speaking of NATO, we just talked about a big anniversary for the Turkish occupation of Cyprus. And Turkey has not proven to be a very reliable ally. It's kind of an outlier in NATO in terms of Azerbaijan, in terms of Hamas, and not to mention the Cyprus issue. Are you going to talk to Turkey in any way or make any suggestions to them at the NATO summit?
So we have a very robust and wide-ranging relationship with Turkey. We've managed, I think, in recent months to focus on the issues where we often disagree, and we're beginning to find some ways forward. I mean, particularly with Cyprus, and the 50th anniversary is something I think many of the citizens on both sides of the Green Zone would like to see resolved. That one of the most important things is that the UN Special Representative, Ms. Olguin, is reappointed. She has a set of very practical ideas that I think could make life better for all the citizens on the island, and we'd like to see that process continue. And that's something we're very direct and have really open discussions with our Turkish allies about.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Moran from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, unfortunately, China's influence, as you know, in the Western Balkans is very strong and in cases growing. How exactly will this budget request help counter China's efforts to expand its influence in the Western Balkans?
Thank you, sir. It's great to see you again after the train ride to Ukraine. This is a really important topic, both China and Russia's efforts to disrupt the region. I see that region having its future being in Europe. So the first thing we need to do is make clear that Chinese involvement, either in critical infrastructure or in debt arrangements across the region, is unacceptable, that it jeopardizes the path forward. That's a message that many of the states in the region have undertaken. When I was recently in Belgrade, Serbia, a Serbian government official was careful to point out to me that there's a Huawei office building, but they've been removed from the telecom infrastructure, and he pointed out that that office building remains 2 stories tall when the Microsoft building next to it has grown to more than 6 stories. So that's the path that they are choosing. And I think those are the kinds of choices we need to confront them with. This budget allows us, and maybe Ambassador McKee can talk about specific programs, but it lets us help instigate the European integration of these economies so that they're buying trusted technology, not Chinese.
Yes, and Ambassador, I wanted to give you a chance to weigh in on that. And I'm sorry I didn't provide you a greeting, actually, when I started my questioning. I'm normally saying hello and thank you for being here, and I would like to extend that courtesy to you. Thank you for being here. Ambassador McKee, from the USAID perspective, what do you think?
So we were working very hard to reduce the space for the PRC to operate. In other words, to give them choice to mobilize, as Ambassador O'Brien mentioned, create better conditions for U.S. companies to come in. When there's a vacuum, less than desirable options, if there are even options, will fill that void. And so we're working, for example, in Kosovo on bolstering their energy sector and diversifying their energy supply with indigenous solar panels on the renewable end versus having to purchase them from the PRC. We are working closely in Serbia to mobilize greater U.S. investment in the IT space, and we're working on advancing private sector engagement, particularly business-to-business exchange in Bosnia and amongst the other Western Balkan countries. That opportunity and that growth, that economic prosperity, reduces the opportunity for the PRC to get its hooks in an economic manner.
So let's talk a little bit about the PRC's influence in Moldova. So we know that this budget requests $55 million in funding for assistance to Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia, funding specifically for Moldova through that funding program. What does the State Department and USAID intend to do with this funding if it is appropriated?
So I'll start quickly. Right now, we are laser focused on the presidential and election and referendum, EU referendum in October. The Kremlin has increased on a horrific level the disinformation and disruption and attempts at vote and other capture. And so we are working hand in glove with the interagency and with the government of Moldova to try and thwart some of those efforts and ensure that both the referendum and the election are free, fair, transparent, and not disrupted by Putin and others. In terms of the economic space, particularly energy, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, last year signaled Moldova's full independence from Gazprom and the Kremlin in terms of access to energy supply. We want to keep that up. And so we're investing in the energy sector to build a new transmission line with Romania, as well as working on stabilizing the grid and other factors that are very necessary, back to what our colleague raised, is showing that democracy can deliver and that partnership with the West is the true future for the Moldovan people.
Thank you. And Secretary, I want to come to you for the final question and comment based on this energy issue exactly, because Moldova and China this past month actually looked like they announced some closer ties in the area of energy. The Deputy Prime Minister for Moldova and the Foreign Minister from China announced China's new energy and infrastructure investments in the country. And that's curious to me and also concerning to me, especially because Moldova is such a center point for munitions, as you know, in the region, and Russia's already got a little hand in there. So, Secretary, what can we do to get in front of that building tie between China and Moldova?
So why don't we come back to you with some more detail on the status of that announcement? What we just did, Secretary Blinken visited a transformer station, which is helping Moldova bring in power from Romania. We're looking at an additional line from Romania. We're under discussions to either repair an old thermal power plant or otherwise to provide additional power so that Moldova is both off Russian power but isn't dependent upon unreliable technology as well. That's very much the direction the Prime Minister and President told us they want to go.
Thank you both. I yield my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Moran. I now yield 5 minutes to Congresswoman from Pennsylvania, Madeline Dean.
I thank you, Chairman Kane and Ranking Member Keating, and I thank the two witnesses for being in front of us again. More importantly, I thank you for your work on behalf of our country and the world. It's an honor to have traveled to Ukraine just following our vote on the supplemental to increase, obviously, the support that was so long awaited. As the chairman just said to me, we're putting the band back together, so it's Kane, Keating, Moran, and Dean back in front of you today. But it was an absolute honor to travel and be able to be there at that time to visit with the president there, to visit with the military generals and support teams. And then I had the chance to go to Normandy and again visit with President Zelensky there, of course, on the extraordinary commemoration of the 80th anniversary of D-Day. All very powerful to me. I want to hearken back or really talk about frozen Russian assets and what we can look forward to there. In his testimony before the committee in May, Secretary Blinken spoke to the efforts being undertaken to start making Russia pay for the damage caused by its full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the funds that could be leveraged to aid Ukraine's reconstruction. He spoke of the work to leverage frozen Russian assets in Europe and how we are seeing some of the results of those efforts. The G7 recently announced plans to use frozen Russian assets as collateral for a $50 billion loan to, among other things, begin rebuilding damaged infrastructure in Ukraine. Assistant Secretary, maybe I'll start with you if you don't mind. What signal, and more importantly, what substance does this prospective G7 loan send to Russia, and what are the next steps in this plan?
Thank you for the support of the supplemental and for the visit. It was a great honor to be on the train with you guys and to
My honor.
exchange notes after we finished our meetings our respective meetings in Kyiv. This is a matter of real vital importance. We have made clear that the supplemental is something that we don't expect to be repeated. What Ukraine needs to say to Putin is, we can beat you on the battlefield. We are holding in the east, we're destabilizing your firing positions, and we're restoring our economy, but with air defense and by keeping our export routes open. For that to continue, they need to be able to make and buy the weapons they need going forward and to keep the economy alive. That means finding sources of money, and Russian money is the best money for this. So this $50 billion, in essence, gives Ukraine the opportunity to say, in 2025, we can continue beating you on the battlefield. Or if you want to discuss a responsible, reasonable peace, we may be open to that. That's Ukraine's choice, but this is fundamental to the broader choice that's in front of us, the ability of Ukraine to continue the fight past the end of this year.
I thank you for that. Ambassador?
I was just going to add to respond to your query on sort of where we are in the process. As you can imagine, with multiple jurisdictions of the immobilized assets, it's complicated. But we are working tirelessly, probably more hours than exist in a day, to work with the G7 partners, obviously greater legal minds than ours, to sort out how that can happen. But we are dedicated and committed to making sure that the loan takes place and that the reflows from the immobilized assets are used to pay off the loan. And as we work through that, we will report to Congress on our progress.
I appreciate it. And Ambassador, if I could stay with you, we're looking this week at top-line proposals that Republicans have put forward for state and foreign operations appropriations bill, with cuts of 11 to 12% in total from FY24 and 19% below the president's budget request. Could you identify for us what those kinds of deep cuts would mean at this time of incredible challenge globally, not only to State Department and Secretary, you can help us here too, but also USAID?
So those cuts would indeed be devastating when we see the uptick in humanitarian crises and conflict around the world only increasing. And so what that means for us, were the cuts to hold, is that we'd have to make even harder trade-offs and prioritization. We're here for Europe and Eurasia, so I fight as hard as I can within the interagency to make sure that we can do all we can at this historical moment for the future of democracy in the free world as I see it, or as we see it. But I will say that that's what we're going to face, is having to make really hard choices between what seems impossible to choose between, and that's saving lives and stemming off crises and conflict around the world as we see it just growing even further. We won't be able to, if the cuts do stick, we won't be able to provide the sustained support and leverage, which has been the power of the resources that we brought to the table with both the supplementals as well as what we hope to do in terms of normalizing the budget. So it would be, frankly, devastating.
I know my time has expired, but maybe, if you don't mind, we could continue the conversation offline, but or if maybe somebody else wants to ask and give you the opportunity, love to hear from you also.
Okay.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you for yielding back your time. I now recognize Mr. Self from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Brien, I had to step out. I would love to have a debate with you one day about what is worse, isolation, which you mentioned in your opening statement, or weakness. And I would appreciate that debate. But at the time when we are facing a new axis of evil around the world, I think that we are also showing weakness around the world. And I would point back to President Reagan that projected peace through strength. So my first question to you is, how do we expect our European allies to wean themselves off of Russian oil and gas when we at the same time are limiting our exports to our European allies, and yet we are not enforcing our sanctions against Russian oil and gas? And I was actually pleasantly surprised to see that the Wall Street Journal had an article just today about how we are pulling our punches on sanctions against Iran and Russia. So the question is, how do we expect our European allies? Are we not driving them back into the Russian oil and gas family?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I'm happy to have a debate, but I don't think the choices are isolation or weakness. I think the choice is strength through a very robust coalition. We've now got a stronger NATO set of allies who are spending more on defense than ever.
Well, we can have that debate later.
We have more than 50 countries who are supporting Ukraine.
The question is, our European allies, Russian oil and gas.
So I think a couple things here. So one point is we've seen Russian dependence on gas, European dependence on Russian gas has plummeted over the last several years. Ambassador McKee mentioned just one country, Moldova, which has gone from 100% dependence to 0. We've seen all of our European allies reduce their dependence on Russian gas. And a part of the reason for that are sanctions. So the European Union just this week adopted a sanctions package against Russian exports of LNG. And so we expect to see Russian LNG exports drop down. So that's an example of them working with us and following our lead on accomplishing just what you say we want. Part of the reason for that is that U.S. has more than doubled our exports of LNG to Europe. And I appreciate the point you're making that the pause has been controversial for some. I think just factually, the pause was intended to study. Secretary Granholm has said it will be in a few months that we'll be in a position to evaluate it. And in the meantime, we have more than enough space under existing permits to further double our exports of LNG to Europe. So I don't think this is relevant to the choices our European allies will make.
Okay, very good. So now let's move to our sanctions on Iranian airline. You probably know that simply landing on an airport is material support. Our European allies, several of them, are not supporting our sanctions on Iranian airlines, which are transporting military equipment to Russia for their fight in Ukraine. So what are you doing to make sure that our European allies are not allowing Iranian airlines to use their airports for material support?
Congressman, we are working with our European allies to enforce sanctions against Iran, and we've taken a number of steps against Iranian firms who are either manufacturing or helping to transport goods from Iran to Europe, and our European allies are joining us in that. The link you're drawing, I frankly have to research and come back to you. I don't believe the airlines who are flying into our European allies are the same companies who are transporting, but I'm happy to research that and come back to you with an answer.
Yes, I have letters from our European allies that I'd be happy to share with you. In the limited time I have left, I would ask you what you are doing on the Association of Serbian Majority Municipalities signature. This is vital. You are not going to pull Serbia out of the Russian orbit. So when are you going to support the ASM signature?
By the government of Kosovo.
By both sides?
Yeah. So it's a condition of the EU-led dialogue.
Right.
That the two sides continue to cooperate, and that Kosovo, in the initial phase, has to submit the statute to its constitutional court.
Kosovo tells me it does not violate their constitution, and I'm about out of time, so I just ask you, I would like for you to come back to me when you're going to support it, okay, the ASM.
Well, we're actively supporting it. Okay. We work on it all the time. I'm happy to give you more detail on where we are.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Self yields back his time. I now recognize Congressman Heisinger from Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm actually going to pick up where my colleague was. I, too, am concerned about the LNG export throttling, and while it's a study, we know it has also paused actions here in the United States for developing that in our capacity. We have a vital interest in weaning our allies, all of our allies, off of Russian energy, also Iranian energy. I happen to sit on the Financial Services Committee where most of those sanctions run through. And, sir, there is a lax of enforcement with sanctions, both in Russia and in Iran. We know it. There is $12 billion sitting in a Qatari bank and $10 billion sitting in an Omani bank right now, based on what has been coming out of Iran. We're not here to talk about Iran. We're here to talk about Europe. But last night, myself and a group had dinner with the ambassador from Sweden and Denmark and a group of Swedish legislators. The Swedish legislators brought up what they called the shadow fleet of Russian off the books energy transportation that's happening in the Baltic Sea. And they're very concerned about that. They're either unregistered, unflagged, or they're changing flags midstream, or they are turning off their transponders. This is exactly what's happening with Iran as well. So that has to be part of the discussion when it comes to sanctions, how we are working with our allies to make sure, as Colonel Self was saying, we are not weakening our allies on that. I want to turn a little bit, though, as well to nuclear energy. And given China's dominance in renewable energy technologies and growing nuclear power industries, the dependence from our adversaries that many of our allies have needs to change. And I'm curious, what presence does China already have in the European energy market? And is its nuclear power industry made any headway in the European market?
So our position on China's investment in any kind of critical infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, is that it's incompatible with having trusted vendors. What we are working on with a number of our European allies is to see American companies, along with our trusted partners, provide nuclear power.
Okay, so that's going to actually leads into my next thing is, how are you promoting and how is this administration promoting the quote-unquote all of above kind of approach supporting energy security in Europe, including nuclear?
So one step is we're very active advocates I've been with the president when he spoke with the president and prime minister of Poland about the importance of us moving forward with an additional U.S.-provided nuclear reactor in Poland on top of the one we are doing. I was just with the secretary in Prague when we talked to the Czechs about bringing in this. Same with the Romanians last week. As well, 97 million, so basically about...
So you're all in on nuclear?
We're all in providing, yes, trusted nuclear power, both small modular reactors and the larger...
And I know there's a lot of work being done on the SMRs right now and have yet to come online. But I want to talk about, because Ambassador McKee, you were saying cuts would be devastating. As was proposed or discussed by my Democrat colleague about the budget. I want to talk about debt. We're sitting at $36 trillion in debt. This is the first year that interest on that debt has surpassed our defense spending. It has become the largest line item, second largest line item in the federal budget, not just surpassing defense, but also Medicare. And the increase is clearly linked to greater debt and higher interest rates. So what I would like to know is our fiscal situation leaving us vulnerable as well to being unable to respond to emergencies as they arise? And does our national debt propose a threat to our national security, much as you were and my colleague were arguing that any cut to a line item would?
I'll have to get back to you on the specifics of our national debt and how it relates to our foreign assistance budget, because that's sort of my narrow scope.
Sure, but the point is that as we've squeezed out other things, I mean, we have a finite amount of money in tax revenue. We've been borrowing. As we borrow, we're having to do more and more interest payments on that. What I'm concerned about, and I'd love to have this conversation, is are we worried about rising interest rates limiting your department's ability to respond to these emergencies that are going on around the world? And I think that is a legitimate conversation that we have to have as well. I know my time has expired, Mr. Chairman, but
Look forward to the
conversation. I yield back.
Thank you. With no further questions from our members, I want to thank our witnesses, Ambassador McKee and Assistant Secretary O'Brien, for their valuable testimony, as well as the members for their questions. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional written questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond to these promptly and in writing. Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you.